Putin's disastrous invasion of Ukraine has really, diminished his geopolitical clout, and it's led to a serious decline in its economic power and frankly, its stability. Without its nuclear arsenal, Russia wouldn't be really much more than a highly aggrieved and failing middle power, and China, of course, knows this.
Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Our esteemed guests from policy, academic, think tank, industry, military, and government backgrounds offer unique insights and analysis that you won't find anywhere else. Get ready to expand your knowledge and engage in thought-provoking discussions with us. A few weeks ago, Presidents Xi and Putin met in Moscow to strengthen their country's strategic partnerships and discuss various regional and global issues. The Xi-Putin summit, as it's been termed, resulted in several agreements, including increased cooperation in energy, technology, and finance, as well as a joint statement on the importance of multilateralism and opposition to quote-unquote hegemonic behavior by other nations. Analysts have perceived the Xi-Putin summit as a demonstration of the growing strategic partnership between China and Russia, which poses a challenge to the global dominance of the United States. In this week's Expert Series, CDA Institute fellow Marcus Kolga discusses the relationship between China and Russia. He argues that while China may see Russia as an ally in its shared contempt for NATO and the liberal democratic order, China does not view Russia as an equal partner. Kolga suggests that Russia needs China for economic reasons, while China only needs Russia as a source of cheap energy and to prevent any issues along its northeastern border. Kolga further argues that the recent ICC indictment against Putin has damaged his reputation and credibility on the global stage, and Russia's influence and credibility have been greatly diminished over the past 14 months. Despite this, Putin needs to be seen standing next to the Chinese president to reinforce the legitimacy of his own power domestically and to demonstrate that Russia is not completely isolated. Kolga believes that China will likely try to exploit Russia's geopolitical and economic decline in the long term. This is the Expert Series. Marcus, thanks for joining us once again. It's always great to have you on the program. What did the summit achieve for each side, and what is Russia's strategic significance to China? Does it signal a deepening of a threatening autocratic alliance? And what impact, if any, has the visit had on the war in Ukraine?
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. First of all, I think that this is an extremely lopsided relationship. What China gets from Russia is cheap gas and other discounted resources. Geopolitically, China may see Russia as an ally that shares its contempt for NATO and the liberal democratic order, but President Xi certainly does not regard Vladimir Putin or Russia as an equal. And of course, image and reputation are also extremely important to China's regime. I'm sure that the ICC indictment against Putin, accusing him of abducting, kidnapping thousands of Ukrainian children, that this loomed large during President Xi's meetings with Putin. I also believe that China, along with most Western nations, probably regards Russia as a spent power that is on the descent. Putin's disastrous invasion of Ukraine has really, diminished his geopolitical clout, and it's led to a serious decline in its economic power and frankly, its stability. Without its nuclear arsenal, Russia wouldn't be really much more than a highly aggrieved and failing middle power, and China, of course, knows this. Now, what did Russia want from China, and what did it get? Well, look, Vladimir Putin desperately needs China to continue buying its oil, gas, and other resources to stave off economic collapse. And Russia will continue to act as China's discount gas station. Putin's armies desperately need Chinese ammunition, weapons, and parts to repair those that have been damaged over the course of the war. And I don't believe that the Chinese president reacted favorably to this request. In the broader sort of geopolitical context, it would be strategically foolish for China to send lethal aid to China, given that the U.S. and the Western world have made it very clear that we will not hesitate to use economic sanctions and massive economic sanctions when foreign adversaries like Russia threaten our interests. And I don't believe that China has any interest in testing this right now. China's relationship with Russia simply isn't worth it. Now, equally important for Russia and Putin is the need for the Russian president to be seen standing next to the Chinese president in order to reinforce the legitimacy of his own power domestically at home and to demonstrate to his own people that Russia is not completely isolated at this point. We know, of course, that this protracted 14-month operation, which Vladimir Putin initially told Russians would last only 3 days, is facing considerable scrutiny inside of the Kremlin and outside of it amongst just regular Russians. So projecting at least a facade of power and strength in the face of this disastrous war is really important for Vladimir Putin to maintain control inside of the Kremlin.
How was the summit received in Russia, and did it give Putin the political boost he was looking for? How resilient would you say both Russia and Putin have been amid the West's attempts to isolate Russia on the global stage?
How was the summit received inside of Russia? Well, look, the Kremlin, of course, controls most media inside of the country and censors most social media platforms aside from YouTube that are being beamed into it from the outside. So, of course, Russian state media portrayed the visit as being, highly successful and to demonstrate, again, to the Russian people that Russia remains a global superpower by standing side by side on the same stage and level as China. And those images may have temporarily distracted Russians, and it may have given Putin a short-term boost in his domestic credibility. However, the losses that we're seeing in Ukraine on the Russian side, especially recently around Bakhmut, the failure of Russian forces to make any real significant gains despite that massive loss of life will eventually creep back into the domestic national debate in Russia. It'll go around the censors, neighbors talking, families talking, and most importantly, that debate for Vladimir Putin will continue to rage, inside the Kremlin. So with regards to Russia's position and image on the global stage, I also think that the recent, ICC indictment against Putin, making him an international fugitive, has probably done irreparable damage to his reputation and credibility on the global stage. The motion tabled in the UN General Assembly in late February calling on Russia to completely withdraw its troops from Ukraine had the support of the majority of UN members. 141 nations supported it. Only 7 members, including Russia, North Korea, Belarus, and a few other authoritarian regimes, voted against it. Even China chose to abstain. And this sends a strong signal, and it demonstrates pretty clearly that Russia's influence and credibility on the global stage seem to have been greatly diminished over the past 14 months or so. And I don't believe that any of that can be recovered, in the short term, and certainly not as long as Vladimir Putin and his gang of kleptocrats remain in power inside the Kremlin.
In your view, what are the key takeaways of the joint statement, deepening the comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for the new era?
What are the key takeaways of that joint statement? Well, look, again, I'm not really all that sure that this partnership is in any way equal, at least not in the eyes of President Xi. For China, it's a smart strategic move to keep Putin on side right now, and to keep that cheap Russian energy flowing into China to power its economy. Along with energy and resources, I think that China needs to make sure that Russia also doesn't cause any problems along its northeastern border in the long term. So, over the next decade, China will probably seek to take advantage of Russia's geopolitical and economic decline, and will try to exploit the resource-rich Russian Far East. Where it's useful for China, it'll probably partner militarily with Russia to further intimidate Asia-Pacific nations, most specifically Japan and Taiwan, and indeed for this new sort of emerging era that will probably come after this war, the partnership between China and Russia will remain until there's some sort of change inside of Russia. After Russian forces retreat from Ukraine, and eventually they will, and if Putin's authoritarian regime is replaced by one that is democratic and Western-facing, I don't expect that this relationship between China and Russia will be sustained in at all the same way. But for now, this strategic partnership is convenient and will continue to be convenient for the Chinese government and for Chinese interests.
Russia repeated its assertion in the joint statement between China and Russia released after the summit that Taiwan is Chinese territory, and added that it, quote unquote, firmly supports China's measures to safeguard its sovereignty and territorial integrity. What role would Russia play in a potential kinetic conflict over Taiwan?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, military partnership between China and Russia in the context of these sort of rising tensions in the Pacific will probably benefit China. They'll use this partnership and joint military exercises to further intimidate Japan and Taiwan and other nations in the region. China will also use this partnership to counter growing Western resistance against China's neo-imperialist ambitions in the region. But should China choose to ignore the global outcry over Russia's invasion of Ukraine and risk a typhoon of economic sanctions and potential isolation by invading Taiwan, I suspect it would count on Russian support for that. But I also believe, and quite strongly, that Western resolve and the unity that we've demonstrated against Russia over the past 14 months is probably causing China to think twice about acting against Taiwan. Western support for Ukraine and our sanctions against Russia have clearly demonstrated to China the types of costs that we are willing to impose, and the kinds of costs that China would face, quite frankly, if it should act out on those neo-imperialist ambitions anywhere in the Asia Pacific, but specifically in Taiwan. And so, China is obviously keeping a very close eye on how we have reacted and how we'll continue to support Ukraine during this invasion.
Do you see a connection between Ukraine and Taiwan? Is it feasible that Xi hopes his support of Russia and Ukraine would deter a US-led Western victory, which could potentially embolden the West in the Indo-Pacific, making it more challenging for Beijing to potentially take Taiwan? What do you think Xi's calculations are here? He seems to be attempting to straddle a line between presenting China as a peacemaker, yet supporting and not condemning Putin's war.
Well, look, unlike Vladimir Putin, Xi is a highly strategic leader. He's not stupid. Unless he has some sort of insights into Russian capabilities that might turn this war around for Vladimir Putin, Xi probably sees the same set of possible outcomes that we in the West are seeing. The likelihood of the kind of victory that Putin hoped for 14 months ago is extremely low. The ICC indictment, again, is unlikely to be the first one. And we know that Russia's economy is teetering and is on the verge of possible collapse. And the Kremlin's rhetoric about the resilience of Russia's economy against Western sanctions has also ended now, just over the past 7 days or so, with Vladimir Putin admitting that our sanctions are causing significant damage to Russia's economy. Of course, President Xi is hoping for a possible Russian victory, but I'm sure that he's aware that under the current circumstances, that looks more and more like an impossibility without significant military support from China. And as I mentioned earlier, the cost for China to do so may be far too high for China to tolerate. I actually believe that the ideal outcome for China is a frozen conflict, a multi-year or even multi-decade ceasefire that keeps Russia and the West on edge and on the verge of war, but not actually warring, and keeping that focus on Europe would be ideal for China. This would free up the Chinese government to act and sort of move more freely in the Indo-Pacific region. In such a scenario, China would maintain the upper hand in its relationship with Russia, and cheap energy would continue flowing into China in the long term. A peaceful resolution to this conflict, one in which Ukraine benefits, and that would completely end the war, would honestly not benefit China much at all. And while it may be trying to position itself as a quote unquote peacemaker, peace and stability in Europe are not specifically, I don't think, China's goals.
To what extent does the ICC warrant further constrain Russia's ability to be a player on the global stage, which it is trying to prove it can still be? What could the international community do to ensure the warrant for Putin's arrest becomes a genuine step towards meaningful justice?
Well, the ICC indictment against Vladimir Putin has probably permanently damaged his reputation. Even before those charges were announced, the UN's independent investigation into Russian war crimes in Ukraine found that Russian soldiers had raped young children, as young as 4 years old, and women as old as 80. And this, in addition to countless other atrocities. The barbaric nature of Russian invasion has also been really well documented, and the evidence of this is quite abundant. Aside from those totalitarian regimes that tolerate and themselves engage in mass human rights abuses like North Korea, Belarus, Iran, Venezuela, or Nicaragua, I think that the global community is turning their backs on Vladimir Putin and Russia. And the ICC indictment is just the first step towards justice and accountability. A few weeks ago, I actually helped organize and host an international dialogue on the creation of an international tribunal for Russian war crimes in Ukraine, a tribunal, sort of like the one that was held in Nuremberg after World War II, would hold the Putin regime to account for the crime of aggression. And this is being supported by a number of our NATO allies, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and of course, Ukraine. If such a tribunal were organized, it's almost certain that the Russian government would be found guilty of the crime of aggression, and any effects of that sort of that verdict would be felt for generations in Russia, and would force, I think, a change in the direction that government is taking, including sort of a lustration of the current government and those apparatchiks that are serving it, and this is exactly the kind of accountability that we need, just as it was in Germany after the Second World War. If the international community does not hold Putin to account for this war, and doesn't demand that Russia pays for all of the costs of the destruction, death, and the chaos that it's caused, this would be also a green light for other totalitarian dictators to continue acting with impunity. So it's really critically important that we do hold Putin and his kleptocratic regime to account for this.
Xi deep down seems to see this relationship as purely transactional, despite some of his superlative comments and endorsements. At the joint press availability following the Xi-Putin summit, Putin seemed much more enthusiastic about what the partnership could achieve than Xi, who some say appeared to be more restrained in his articulation of the partnership. How aware is Putin of the fact that China is the dominant partner in this relationship, and how do you suspect he feels about it? Do you think this power asymmetry is or could become a point of friction?
Look, again, as I said at the start of the podcast, there's nothing equal in the relationship between Russia and China, or Putin and Xi. President Xi knows exactly who he is dealing with, and I'm frankly surprised that he even made that trip to Moscow at all, because it lowers China's and Xi's stature, and they sort of seem to be bowing to, quite frankly, a fugitive leader who's accused of kidnapping children and dragging his country into a bloody and probably unwinnable war that is leading to Russia's economic ruin. For China, maintaining the current state of the conflict and continuing to benefit from cheap Russian energy and resources, and in advancing its hegemonic aspirations in the Asia-Pacific region are probably right now worth the price of partnering with what is clearly a criminal government. But eventually, the Putin regime and this relationship between Russia and China will probably come to an end. And this will happen when Ukraine wins this war and when Russia is forced into a period of political transformation afterwards. And there will likely be changes in the geopolitical alignment, and those changes may also disrupt the status of China's relationship with Russia. But for the time being, the Chinese government will seek to exploit and benefit from this conflict, and it will continue to act strategically and likely avoid exposing itself to unnecessary risk, which will mean not getting directly involved in it by supplying Russia with any sort of arms or any sort of supplies to help it in its invasion. Aside from pumping discounted gas into China and superficial political support, Russia will just continue to fight its illegal war against Ukraine, primarily on its own.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. Thanks for tuning in. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.